Hello, welcome back to part 2 of All About EQ. Thank you for watching part 1. If you haven't watched it, then I suggest you pause this video, open a new tab, quickly go to my channel again, watch part 1 and come back and I'll be waiting for you here. Alright, looks like you're back. Great. To summarize part 1, we looked at what is an EQ, why do we need to use an EQ, and what is the EQ mindset, which is a very crucial thing to understand, and it's discussed in part 1. I really hope you watched it. And also the different elements within an EQ being the filters, the shelves, and the different parametric bands, and what you do with all the features available under each of these different elements. And today we are going to look at why are there so many EQ plugins, which one is right for me, and why is context so important. Let's take question 1. Why are there so many EQs? Now this is a very relevant question, and the reason being, if you saw what is there under an EQ plugin, what's happening under the hood, as discussed in the first video again, you understand there are not very many things that's going on. And if that's kind of essentially what's happening under an EQ, why do you need so many different kinds of EQ? Then why can't you just buy one plugin and survive with that? Or can you do that in the first place? Of course you can. Simple answer is there are so many brands making an EQ plugin and trying to make it as unique as they can, either by simply changing the user interface, sometimes even changing the different names or terminologies used within it, which kind of gives it a little uniqueness to it in a way, or adding certain features which you may not find in traditional EQ, like what you find within a DAW, whether it's Pro Tools or Logic or Ableton or whatever DAW that you use. For example, the Infinity EQ by Slate Digital. It's a fabulous EQ. You should check it out. And the Fab Filter Pro Q. That's another beautiful EQ plugin being used by so many different engineers across the globe. And it seems to be one of the most transparent sounding EQs without doing anything to your sound. We'll discuss that in a moment. And there is also the Isotopes plugin, and they also have EQ within their Ozone series, and you should check them out. They are fabulous sounding plugins. Do you need all of them? Definitely not. You can get really good sounding results with what you already have. However, having some of these third-party plugins can provide certain features which you may not find in the traditional ones, and that can be helpful. Let's quickly take a look at those. All right, let's take a look at the default plugin here that we have, which we kind of studied the last week. I'm resizing it, and I've also opened an Infinity EQ by Slate Digital. I don't have the Fab Filter Pro Q or the Ozone, the Ozone by Isotope. I don't use those. So I'm going to use the Infinity EQ by Slate Digital to show you some of the possibilities that this EQ provides, which your default EQ may not be able to provide. Firstly, there are certain similarities. As you can see, you can look at the volume levels here by how much you're going to be cutting or boosting. It gives you some kind of an indication here, and here you can see the frequency bands that it is going to be affecting, which is very similar to this. However, you don't see any of these bands or different elements within the EQ that we saw here, because as you move the cursor, you hover the cursor to different regions of this EQ, you will find that you can, if you click here, it's going to be opening a shelf. If I click here, it's going to be opening a filter. If I click there, it's going to be opening a bell curve, a parametric bell curve. And you basically, depending on where you hover the cursor, you'll find that you can add different kinds of things. And as the name suggests, you can click and add as many as you want. That's the most beautiful part of it. So now let's click here and open a bell curve, and let's just see what happens to it. Firstly, you can turn it on or off. And secondly, you can set the shape of this bell curve by choosing the dB slope. And you see there, it lets you go up to 120 decibels per octave. And you are making this curve go like a weird U shape, which you can't do on your default Logic plugin. I'm not saying you need to be able to do this, but it allows you to do all kinds of ridiculous, crazy things. And you can find some interesting sounds with that. You can also choose to either use a traditional cue like how you use within Logic. You can either broaden the curve or make it narrow. That's kind of up to you. And when you choose this, it affects that curve that you've chosen here. It affects whether it's going to be like a U-shaped or whether it's going to be like a nice natural or V-ish shape. You get the idea basically. Apart from that, suppose you found a nice little frequency that you specifically wanted to cut or boost, and then you feel that this is what you want to do and you don't want to move that, you can lock it in place. And also you can select whether you want to affect this cut to both the stereo signals, that's both the left, right, and whatever is in the center, all of it, or you want to affect it only to the signals that are panned dead center, or you want to affect it to the signals that are panned to the left and right only, that's the sides. You can do a mid-side EQ basically per band, which means you can have one of the bands set to stereo mode and click open another band, make a boost there, and set that to the sides only. And that's the most beautiful part. You can't do that here because here, whatever processing setting you have chosen, whether it's a stereo signal or it's going to be a mid or side or right or left, it's going to affect all the moves that you make to that particular side or part of the channel itself. But here you can choose within one plugin how you want to do it. And also some really cool things here. Apart from that, you can also click on this monitor solo button. So when you're making this boost, you can hear what's actually happening when you're boosting there. For example, let me just remove this. Let's open, this is on a flute track. Let's quickly play. Okay, let me open it on maybe this Picato track. Let me just open a Infinity EQ and let's see what it does. Open a band and we are going to make a boost, and while it plays we are going to hear what it does to the sound. So you see, you can use the monitor button, the headphone monitor button, and it'll let you hear what's happening while you're making this boost. Let's hear it once again. So essentially, it's telling you the signal that you're boosting sounds like this, which is a beautiful and a very handy feature that you get with this. So there are a bunch of things like these. Even when you click on a filter, in this case being a high pass filter or a low cut filter, you can choose up to a ridiculous 120 dB per octave, and that just looks like some kind of a steep cliff. You can make all those kinds of drastic settings if you want to, and going all the way up to even as something as little as 0.06 or 0.18 or 0.32 decibels per octave, which is very, very, very minute. You can do a whole bunch of things. If you don't like it, you can just go and delete the band, and that's the most beautiful part of it. So these are just some of the things that I'm just trying to show you that this EQ can do that your default EQ can't do, and that hopefully gives you a gist of it. All right, I hope that helped. There is a part two to this question, sort of like a deviation to this question, and again a fairly relevant one. What about hardware emulations? To understand this really well, let's kind of time travel and go back to the old recording days. Before digital plugins came into existence, studios used hardware units, physical hardware units, hand-built by most of these companies, and using specific components from specific parts of the country even, because they added up to give you a certain kind of a sound that was very unique to each unit. And engineers usually refer to this as color or character. Now, what do they mean by it? In simple words, let's just assume that this microphone that's in front of me is some form of an EQ hardware unit, and we are passing signal into it, and the signal comes out of it. Now, the signal that goes in and comes out is not the same because of the components within it and what it is doing to the sound. Somehow, when the signal goes in and comes out, there seems to be a very subtle but audible difference. And this is something that became very desirable by most audio engineers across the globe. Now, what does the difference look like? Sometimes, even without moving any knob on the EQ, it would add a certain body or a certain amount of an EQ curve to the sound, even without moving a knob. And sometimes it could be compression, or sometimes it could be saturation. When you drive the knobs a certain way, when you push, let's say you select a certain frequency and you push that, you boost it by like something as ridiculous as 18 dB, on an SSL console. You can do that and you get a really sweet sounding highs. It doesn't get really harsh and annoying, something that could happen with these modern digital plugins, which wouldn't happen there. And that's the reason why the name musical EQ comes from, because essentially, even if you make drastic difference in your sound, you make drastic moves, which is why big engineers like Andrew Sheps, Chris Lord-Alge, Greg Wells, or whoever it is that you see, especially CLA, making really bold moves in his EQ and compression, because it just sounded great. It just kind of got you the sound that you're after. Why were they doing it? It's because of that color. It's because of that character, because that's the sound that they had in their minds, and they wanted their drums to slam in a certain way. They wanted the guitars to jump out of the speakers and feel more energetic and in your face in a certain way. And they were able to do that with these EQs. It added that color, it added that energy, it added that aggression and whatever it is that they were looking for. In modern digital plugins, achieving this can be a little tough because of the transparency and how clear these plugins are. They don't affect your signal in any way. And that can be great, by the way, for some engineers and musicians, because they know what sound they're looking for. They go after it, they dial their tones and they record it, and they don't want any of these plugins that they throw into their session to go and mangle that sound in any way. That's totally fine. And for some, it could be a boring choice. They may like the color of the analog plugins, and these analog hardware units are really expensive. So the plugins is the easiest and the closest way of trying to achieve that type of a sound. And we're looking at, I don't know, maybe $10,000s for a hardware unit, and your plugin happens to be maybe $150 or less than that. Nowadays, even $50. Quite a bit. For example, Slate Digital Everything Bundle offers a whole bunch of these emulations. Waves has beautiful emulations, and they've also tied up with some of these big engineer names that I mentioned a few minutes ago. They have made analog emulations or recreations of these analog consoles that they personally use in their studio. They've tried to recreate that sound that they sort of chased and achieved. Alternatively, parametric EQs, the digital ones I'm talking about, have the flexibility to be able to choose whatever frequency you want to choose, select the Q, how narrow, how broad you want, and how much of a boost and cut, and you get great flexibility with it, which is harder to find in some of these analog emulations, because some of these analog emulations, based on the original hardware, the frequency bands are set, so you can either notch from one to the next. You can't kind of go in between in some cases. And also the Q is fixed, meaning you can't adjust how broad or narrow the Q is supposed to be. And there is a certain behavior that it follows, and that's just that. However, it was pleasing to the musical ear, which is again the reason why these things became musical EQs or musical compression. So there are certain benefits of using this. It just depends on what do you want or what do you like? Which brings us to the next question. Which one is right for me? If you're a beginner, then I highly recommend start off with what you have within your DAW, be it Pro Tools or Logic or Ableton, whatever you're using, because the plugins that comes within your DAW, the default plugins, are designed to be extremely simple and easy to understand with all the basic features that you need. And once you learn it, once you learn what each of these things do and how do you use it, and you play around with them and gain some experience with it, and you then switch over to these third-party plugins, it becomes easier to understand these third-party, because the moment you open these fancy user interface plugins with so many different additional small little features, you start understanding what is it actually doing to your sound, rather than opening it for the first time and being really overwhelmed by all those different features, and you're like, oh my God, what do you do with it? So it really helps if you start off with the default plugins. If you're a beginner, then I highly recommend start off with the default plugins that comes within your DAW, whether it's Logic, whether it's Pro Tools or Ableton, because the default plugins are very simple to understand. They're very easy. All the features that you need to know how an EQ works is already present in it. And once you learn that and you spend some time with it, you start using it, it becomes easier to switch over to these third-party plugins, because sometimes the third-party plugins can get very overwhelming for you. And additionally, there's an added feature to it. What if you're stuck in a certain location and you need to work on a project or something like that, which I've done, and it's great doing that sometimes, and you don't have your iLock or you don't have a good internet connection for you to kind of authorize these plugins while opening a new session. So you are forced to use the default plugins, or whatever you have. And what are you going to do in such situations? Understanding the default plugins and learning how to climb the rope from there really has added benefits. So I highly recommend taking that route. However, if you are somebody who's been using these plugins or different kind of plugins, you've been doing this for a while, chances are maybe you already have a few third-party plugins, in which case, again, I would still recommend this workflow. Try to learn the features, try to know what you're doing before you start doing it, try to know what each of those buttons and knobs do within those EQ plugins. And again, you don't have to waste a ton of money buying more and more plugins, because all these plugin companies, all the websites are essentially trying to throw these deals at you, hoping that you're going to go and keep buying their stuff. I'm not saying they're bad. They're fabulous stuff and they're great to have. But I'm just saying that you don't need to go and buy all of them, and that's not going to make you a better producer or a better recording engineer or a better mixing engineer, whatever it is. What really matters is your skill. And once you get onto the path of improving your skill and gaining more knowledge and understanding of how to use these things, you will realize, or you will automatically start going back to some of the most basic and simpler plugins, because you feel, hey, this just gets my job done and I don't really need anything more. And that's kind of what you see with some of these really big engineers. They have maybe a channel strip and they just stick to that. They pretty much do all their processing within that little channel strip. Go check out and you kind of know for yourself. Now, the third question, what about presets? And why is the context so important? I kind of added this preset thing to it because preset seems to be such an important thing while discussing context. Presets, in my opinion, can do more harm than good. And let me tell you why. Firstly, the recording that you have with you has not been done in the same room as where these presets were made, for example. And you didn't have the same kind of equipment, the same kind of microphone, the same musicians, the same equipment. So the sound that you had, or these people had, while they created these presets and saved them and started providing them for you, may not work for the sounds that you're capturing and recording in your studio or in your bedroom, because the levels are different, the gear that you've used is different, and your audio interface is different, your microphones are different, your cables are different, your instrument is different, the way you play your instrument, more importantly, is very different. And then you go and throw this thing, which is maybe more like a generic starting point, and then you realize it's actually not improving your sound. If you open a mix session, for example, and you started popping presets on every channel within an EQ, just see what happens to your mix in the end. It really starts getting weird and loud, and that's true. It gets really loud because a lot of these are not gain matched. Meaning you open an EQ, you make a few moves, and then you bypass the EQ and then turn it back on. You realize there is a bump in the level, the output level, and that's because all the boost that you have done in your EQ has taken the volume, overall volume, a tad bit up. And as you do that to each and every channel, cumulatively they increase the volume, and sometimes that can start clipping your output or your stereo bus meter. So you don't want to do that. However, they can be a good starting point for you to learn from. Meaning, if you're very new to this and you're just starting off and you're kind of like too confused with how do you use an EQ, what frequencies do you boost, what frequencies do you cut, how do you learn all these things, throw in a preset and just see what have they done, and then try bypassing each band or each of those, either the shelves or the filters or the parametric bands, and just see what happens. What is that move that they have done doing to your sound? Is it helping? Is it making it worse? Is it bringing out some of the things that you don't necessarily want to hear within that track? So do try to use presets to learn from. It's still fine, but don't resort to using presets alone. You gain a lot more by learning how to use it and finding your own settings to play with. Actually, let's try and take a look at some examples, and see how it affects your sound. Okay, so I have a little session here that I created by dragging a funk electric guitar loop from Logic Loops, and then I programmed a little bit of drums and bass on it. So let's just give this a quick listen before we do anything to this, okay? You get the idea. That's pretty much what it is. Now let's go to the drum track. I have a drum bus track here, and what we're going to do is I'm going to load an EQ. I've already done that, and I have this preset from within Logic called Vintage Drums. And what I want to do is just do a before and after and just show you how this preset actually damages my drum sound. Now with EQ, all of a sudden my drum seems to sound very telephonic-ish and boxy and kind of a little weird. It's lost the punch, it's lost the openness. I mean, of course, throwing in a low cut or a high pass filter at about 130 hertz removes a huge chunk of the punch that comes from the kick drum. The low end is kind of gone in that sense. So, and also cutting off so much, shelving off so much from 4600 hertz, roughly like 4K-ish. Bad idea, because a lot of the snare top, that ring that you get from snare top, and also the cymbals and the hi-hats and all that sheen is kind of in that area, and it kind of does damage. So you see this preset is actually doing damage to my drum sound. So I'm definitely not going to be using this. Let's try doing something on maybe the electric guitars. Let's take this. It's like I said, it's a Logic loop. Okay, and on this, I have a very simple low cut or a high pass filter, and I've cut everything below 232 hertz. But let's try and let's give this a listen before we do anything else. You can kind of hear that root note in the guitar track without the EQ, but the reason I used and I wanted to kind of roll that off a bit is I wanted to play around with the bass and see if I could add those root notes and maybe even change the root notes on the bass and not let this guitar loop kind of drive things for me so much. So all of a sudden you don't hear those root notes as obviously. I could definitely go even more drastic and cut more highs, but I've not done that. Or rather, I meant to say, sorry, cut more lows. I could, of course, go even more drastic and cut more lows and kind of make it even more thin. Kind of gets super thin, maybe not my thing. So let's kind of go back to where we were roughly. Yeah. Now what I'm going to do is load in a few presets. Let's go to guitar. Let's see what all we have here. Acoustic guitar, clean up guitar. Let's see what it does. Wow. It definitely does clean up a little bit of that low mid area, but my root notes are back, which I didn't want. So you see this preset, although it's not making the guitar sound worse, it's kind of not helping my context. It's not helping me for what I want the EQ to achieve. And electric funk, exactly what we're doing. Let's see what happens here. It's a bit shrilly. It's okay. It's better than the previous preset. It's still a bit shrilly. This thing is making it shrilly. Maybe something like that might still be okay. But also, let's check if it's making my track louder without EQ. It's about minus 17-ish. It's peaking around there, but let's do it with EQ now and see what happens. Hitting minus 13, minus 17 to 13, that's a bit of a jump. Now that's, again, when you, right now we're looking at only one track, so it doesn't feel like a big deal. But when it starts accumulating across many tracks, especially if you're working on a bigger session. I mean, right now what we have is, I don't think you'll ever have a session with just 3 tracks like mine. But even if you have about 10 tracks, and you're working through and you have this problem of the track getting louder and louder because of EQ moves and stuff like that, you're bound to start clipping your stereo out or this master bus here. That's not what we want to do. So in a way, it's not making it worse, but it's kind of not helping. It is making it worse with regards to levels, increasing that bit of harshness. Guitar sweetener. Not bad, but I still hear the root notes. I don't want that to happen. So you see, I mean, you get an idea of what I'm trying to say. So thank you for watching this video, and I hope this video brought you one more step closer to understanding EQ than you did before watching this. And there are more questions to this, and the sweep approach. There is how do you identify the right frequencies to boost or cut? How do you keep a context, that is the musical genre, in mind while using a certain EQ or presets or whatever it is that you want to do with, and also gain matching or volume balancing and all of that stuff, which I'm going to be addressing in part 3, and that's going to be more of a practical stuff. Maybe I'll open a session and we'll go through that, and let's throw in a few presets and see what happens and stuff like that. So see you in part 3 of the video, and thank you so much for staying with me till now. Don't forget to create, play, and record, and I'll see you soon in another video episode. Have fun.